The morning sun cast long shadows across the royal gardens of Veltar as Queen Lyra walked slowly between the rows of exotic plants. Her purple skin glowed softly in the light, and her forearms moved gracefully as she examined each flower and leaf. The garden was her refuge from the endless meetings and court ceremonies that filled her days as ruler of the Veltari Empire. She stopped beside a withering plant with silver leaves and frowned. The rare bloom from the distant moon of Kepler had been her pride for months, but now it looked sick and dying. No matter what the royal botanists tried, nothing seemed to help it recover. "The soil is too rich," came a quiet voice from behind her. Lyra turned to see a human male kneeling beside a flower bed about 20 feet away. He was unremarkable in appearance, with brown hair and simple work clothes covered in dirt. She had seen him around the palace grounds before, but had never spoken to him directly. "I beg your pardon," she said in the formal tone she used with all palace staff. The human looked up, and his face reddened slightly when he realized he had spoken to the queen without being addressed first. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I should not have spoken out of turn." "What did you mean about the soil being too rich?" Lyra asked, genuinely curious. The human stood and brushed dirt from his hands. "That plant there, the silver leaf from Kepler. I have seen them growing wild on asteroid mining stations where the soil is poor and rocky. They actually need harsh conditions to thrive. The rich palace soil is killing it with kindness." Lyra studied the man more carefully. Most palace workers either cowered in fear when she spoke to them or tried to impress her with flowery compliments. This human simply spoke about plants as if they were old friends. "You know about Kepler silver leaf," she said. "I have traveled to many worlds," the human replied. "Plants tell stories about the places they come from if you know how to listen to them." Over the following days, Lyra found herself returning to the gardens more often. The human, whose name was David, was always there tending to some corner of the vast grounds. She began asking him questions about various plants and found his knowledge impressive. He spoke about soil chemistry and plant genetics with the same passion her military advisors discussed battle tactics. "Where did you learn so much about botany?" she asked one afternoon as they walked past a pond filled with floating purple flowers. "Here and there," David said with a small smile. "I find peace in growing things. There is something hopeful about planting a seed, knowing it will become something beautiful if you care for it properly." The weeks passed, and their conversations grew longer. David never asked about her royal duties or tried to gain favor with political talk. Instead, he shared stories about rare plants he had encountered on distant worlds and listened with genuine interest when she described the challenges of maintaining such a diverse garden. "The nobles who court you must bring you expensive gifts," David said one day as they examined a new species of climbing vine. "Jewels and rare metals mostly," Lyra replied. "Things meant to impress rather than bring joy." The next morning she found a small clay pot on her garden table with a note written in David's careful handwriting. Inside the pot was a tiny seedling with leaves that shimmered like starlight. "This comes from the caves of Rigel 7, the note read. "The miners call them hope lights because they glow in the darkness underground. I thought you might enjoy watching it grow." Lyra felt something warm spread through her chest as she held the small pot. No suitor had ever given her a gift that required time and care to appreciate. The seedling was beautiful in its potential rather than its current appearance. As the months passed, other members of the royal court began to notice the queen's frequent visits to the gardens and her conversations with the human groundskeeper. Whispers followed her through the palace halls about the unseemly attention she paid to a mere servant. "Your Majesty," said Lord Thane, her chief advisor, during one of their weekly meetings, "perhaps it would be wise to maintain more appropriate distance from the palace staff. There are rumors spreading about your friendship with the human gardener." Lyra's eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her voice level. "David is knowledgeable about horticulture, and I enjoy our discussions about the gardens. I see no impropriety in learning from someone with expertise." "Of course not, Your Majesty," Lord Thane said quickly. "I merely suggest that such learning might be done through written reports rather than personal meetings." That evening, Lyra found David in the greenhouse tending to seedlings under grow lights. She had been thinking about her advisor's words all day and realized they bothered her more than they should have. "David," she said, "what do you think of the royal court?" He looked up from his work and considered the question carefully. "I think it is full of people who have forgotten that power should be used to help things grow rather than control them." "And what about me?" she asked. "Do you see me as just another member of the court?" David set down his watering can and turned to face her fully. "I see you as someone who understands that the most beautiful gardens require both strength and gentleness. You rule an empire, but you still take time to care for individual plants. That tells me who you really are." 6 months later, the palace buzzed with shock and gossip as Queen Lyra announced her engagement to David the gardener. The ceremony was small and simple by royal standards, held in the palace gardens surrounded by the plants they both loved. David refused all offers of titles and honors, saying he was content to remain the palace groundskeeper. As they exchanged vows under an arch of flowering vines, Lyra looked into her new husband's calm brown eyes and felt a peace she had never experienced before. Here was someone who loved her not for her power or position, but for the person she was when she knelt in the dirt beside her plants. The wedding guests whispered among themselves about the queen marrying so far beneath her station, but Lyra paid them no attention. She had found something more valuable than political alliance or social advantage. She had found someone who saw beauty in small growing things and chose to nurture them rather than use them for his own purposes. The peace of the palace gardens was shattered on a cold morning 3 months after the royal wedding. Queen Lyra was reviewing agricultural reports when General Marcus burst through the doors of her private study with his face pale and his hands shaking. "Your Majesty," he said, breathing heavily, "we have received urgent communications from our border worlds. The Krex Empire has launched simultaneous attacks on Outer Rim colonies Alpha, Beta, and Gamma." Lyra felt her blood turn cold. The Krex were known throughout the galaxy for their brutality and their hunger for conquest. Their red-scaled warriors showed no mercy to civilian populations, and their military technology was among the most advanced in known space. "How bad is it?" she asked, though she could already see the answer in her general's expression. "Alpha Colony is completely destroyed, Your Majesty. 20,000 civilians dead. Beta Colony is under siege with heavy casualties reported. Gamma Colony has gone silent, and we assume the worst." The next few hours passed in a blur of emergency meetings and urgent military preparations. The royal court filled with panicked nobles and military officials, all talking at once about defense strategies and evacuation plans. Reports continued to arrive from the border, each one worse than the last. "The Krex fleet consists of at least 40 heavy cruisers and twice as many smaller attack ships," reported Admiral Stone, the head of naval operations. "Our forces in that sector number only 15 ships total. They were overwhelmed within the first hour of combat." "What about our allies?" asked Lord Thane. "Surely the Galactic Federation will send aid." "I have sent messages to all friendly worlds," General Marcus replied grimly. "But the nearest Federation fleet is 6 weeks away at best. The Krex will have swept through half our territory by then." Lyra listened to the chaos around her with growing despair. The Veltari Empire had enjoyed peace for over 50 years, and their military had grown soft from lack of real conflict. They were unprepared for the savage efficiency of Krex warfare. Throughout these emergency sessions, David remained quietly in the background. As the royal consort, he was allowed to attend meetings but had no official role in government. He stood near the windows, occasionally tending to the small plants that decorated the meeting rooms, and listened to the discussions with his usual calm expression. "Perhaps we should consider terms of surrender," suggested Minister Vale, the treasurer. "If we offer tribute and trade concessions, the Krex might be willing to negotiate rather than continue their advance." "Surrender," General Marcus sputtered. "We are the Veltari Empire. We do not bow to barbarians." "Better to bow than to be wiped out completely," Vale shot back. "Look at what they did to Alpha Colony. Do you want that fate for our homeworld?" David moved quietly to a drooping fern in the corner and began adjusting its position to catch more light from the window. "Sometimes the smallest seeds survive the harshest winters," he said softly, more to the plant than to the room. "What was that?" Lord Thane asked sharply, annoyed by the interruption. "Nothing important," David replied, returning to his plant care. "Just gardener philosophy." The meeting continued with increasingly desperate suggestions. Some advisors wanted to retreat to the inner worlds and abandon the outer colonies. Others proposed forming hasty alliances with minor planetary governments that might provide additional ships. All of the plans seemed hopeless against the overwhelming force of the Krex advance. Over the following days, the news grew steadily worse. Beta Colony fell after a brutal 3-day siege. The Krex fleet had split into smaller groups that struck at multiple targets simultaneously, making it impossible for the scattered Veltari forces to mount an effective defense. Refugee ships began arriving at the capital world carrying horrific stories of the attacks. "They burn everything," sobbed a survivor from Beta Colony during a refugee debriefing. "Not just military targets but schools and hospitals and homes. They want us to know that resistance means complete destruction." Lyra found herself unable to sleep, spending her nights walking through the palace gardens trying to find some peace in the familiar plants and pathways. David often joined her on these walks, moving silently beside her among the flower beds. "My people are suffering," she said during one of these midnight wanderings. "Thousands are dead and thousands more will die before this is over. The military advisors speak of honor and glory, but they have no real solutions." David stopped beside a patch of night-blooming flowers that glowed softly in the darkness. "In wartime, the obvious solutions are often the wrong ones," he said quietly. "The enemy expects you to fight the way you have always fought." "And how should we fight?" Lyra asked, desperate for any hope. "I do not know enough about your military capabilities to say," David replied. "But I do know that weeds can kill the strongest trees if they grow in the right places." The War Council meetings became more frantic as Krex forces continued their advance toward the core worlds. Intelligence reports indicated they would reach the outer system of the capital world within 2 weeks. The remaining Veltari fleet was no match for their numbers and firepower. "We must evacuate the government to the emergency bunkers," insisted General Marcus. "At least then the chain of command will survive even if the capital falls." "Run and hide like frightened children," spat Admiral Stone. "I would rather die fighting than cower in underground holes." David had been standing near a window, apparently absorbed in caring for a small succulent plant that sat on the windowsill. He had been doing this throughout all the recent meetings, tending to the various plants in the meeting rooms while the adults discussed matters of war and survival. "The meetings are becoming quite heated," Lyra said to him privately after another particularly angry session. "Yes," David agreed, gently turning his plant toward better light. "Fear makes people choose between fighting and running when sometimes the best choice is neither." "What do you mean?" David was quiet for a moment, studying the small plant in his hands. This little one survived on a desert world where the temperature reaches 50 degrees during the day and drops below freezing at night. It does not fight the heat or run from the cold. It simply adapts and endures until conditions change. Lyra studied her husband's profile as he spoke. There was something in his voice, a quiet certainty that she had not heard before. Throughout their marriage, David had always been gentle and soft-spoken, more interested in soil composition than politics. But lately, she had noticed him watching the military briefings with unusual attention and asking detailed questions about troop movements and supply lines. "David," she said carefully, "you seem very interested in the tactical reports for someone who claims to know nothing about military matters." He looked at her with his calm brown eyes and she saw something flicker behind them, just for a moment. "I find it useful to understand all aspects of the kingdom I now call home," he said. "Gardens and battlefields are not so different. Both require careful planning and attention to details that others might overlook." Queen Lyra could not sleep again. The latest reports from the front lines painted a grim picture of Krex forces advancing steadily toward the capital system. 3 more colonies had fallen in the past week, and refugee ships crowded the space around the homeworld. She rose from her bed and walked quietly through the palace corridors, not wanting to wake David, who seemed to be one of the few people in the palace who could still rest peacefully. She headed toward her private study, thinking she might review the evacuation plans that General Marcus had prepared. Perhaps there was something she had missed, some detail that could help save more of her people. As she approached the door, she heard voices coming from inside. Lyra paused, confused. Her study was supposed to be locked and empty at this hour. She pressed her ear to the door and heard David's voice speaking in crisp, precise tones that were completely different from his usual gentle manner. "Confirm grid reference 77 Alpha, he was saying. "I need exact casualty numbers from the Beta Colony defensive position, not estimates." Lyra felt her heart begin to race. David was speaking perfect galactic military standard, the official language used by professional military forces throughout the galaxy. She had never heard him use anything but simple common speech before. She opened the door quietly and saw David standing at her communications console with a headset on, speaking to someone through an encrypted channel. Star charts and tactical displays covered her desk, marked with notes in his handwriting. He was wearing the same simple clothes he always wore, but his entire posture and manner had changed. This was not the humble gardener she had married. Negative on the direct assault option, David continued into his headset. The Kreks expect conventional tactics. We need to think like... He stopped speaking as he noticed Lyra standing in the doorway. For a long moment, they stared at each other in silence. David slowly removed his headset and set it on the desk, his calm brown eyes never leaving her face. "Who are you really?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David was quiet for several heartbeats, and she could see him making some kind of internal decision. When he spoke, his voice was still soft but carried a new weight of authority. "My name is David Clark," he said. "Former colonel in the Terran Defense Corps, retired." "Terran Defense Corps," Lyra repeated numbly. The TDC was legendary throughout the galaxy for their unconventional warfare tactics and their ability to defeat much larger forces through superior strategy and ruthless efficiency. "I served for 12 years, David continued, moving around the desk but keeping his distance from her. "I specialized in asymmetric warfare and deep reconnaissance missions. I retired 3 years ago after the vegan campaign." Lyra remembered the vegan campaign. It had been front-page news across the galaxy when a small human force had defeated a massive invasion fleet through tactics so brutal and effective that other species began to fear humanity's military potential. "You were there," she said. "I planned most of it," David said simply. "Along with about 6 other operations that you probably read about in the news. We were very good at our job." "Why did you lie to me?" Lyra asked, anger beginning to replace her shock. "Why did you pretend to be just a gardener?" David sat down heavily in her desk chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "Because I was tired of being good at killing things. I wanted to try being good at growing things instead." He gestured to the tactical displays spread across the desk. "I came to Veltar because it was peaceful and beautiful and because your people had a reputation for valuing art and culture over conquest. I thought I could disappear into civilian life and forget about military strategy and casualty reports." "But you have been watching our military situation," Lyra said, pointing at the notes and charts. "Yes," David admitted. "I tried to ignore it at first, but the Kreks tactics are textbook aggressive expansion. They rely on overwhelming force and terror tactics to break enemy morale quickly. Your people are fighting exactly the way they expect you to fight. And you know a better way." David looked at her with an expression that mixed sadness with determination. "I know several better ways. The question is whether you want to hear them." Lyra moved closer to the desk and studied the materials David had assembled. She could see troop movement charts, supply line analyses, and what looked like detailed intelligence reports on Kreks' military capabilities. "How did you get all this information?" she asked. "I still have contacts in the TDC intelligence network," David said. "And I have been quietly analyzing your military reports for the past 2 weeks. Your generals are competent, but they think like peacekeepers, not warriors." "Show me what you mean." David stood and moved to a large star map on the wall. He pointed to the areas marked in red where Kreks forces were advancing. "Look at their pattern of attack," he said. "They strike hard at defended positions to create maximum casualties and fear. But they are not trying to hold territory. They are trying to force you into a direct confrontation where their superior numbers will guarantee victory." "So what should we do instead?" "Stop fighting their war," David said. "The Kreks war machine depends on supply lines that stretch across half the galaxy. Their ships need fuel and ammunition and replacement parts. Their soldiers need food and medical supplies." David traced lines on the map showing the routes between Kreks territory and their advancing fleets. Cut the supply lines and the invasion force becomes stranded. Attack their logistics bases and their advance stops. Force them to spread their forces thin, protecting their rear areas, and they lose their numerical advantage. Lyra studied the map with growing understanding. "Guerrilla warfare." "Exactly," David said. "Your people see it as dishonorable because you have been at peace for so long. But there is no honor in letting your civilians be slaughtered by an enemy who shows no mercy. You could help us implement these tactics." David was quiet for a long time, staring at the star map with an expression of deep conflict. "I retired for a reason, Lyra," he said finally. "I have seen too many worlds burn and too many good people die because someone like me decided that victory was worth any price. I came here to grow flowers, not to plan more death." "But people are dying anyway," Lyra said. "My people. Your people now, since we are married. Would you let them all die just to keep your own hands clean?" David turned away from the map and walked to the window that looked out over the palace gardens. In the distance, she could see the lights of refugee camps that had been set up in the royal parks. The War Council meeting the next morning was tenser than any Lyra had attended since the crisis began. General Marcus and Admiral Stone sat rigidly in their chairs as David presented his analysis of the Krek's advance, using detailed charts and tactical projections that impressed even the skeptical military leaders. "The enemy has committed 70% of their available forces to the current offensive," David explained, pointing to positions on the star map. "This leaves their home territory and supply lines relatively undefended." "We know this already," General Marcus said impatiently. "But our remaining fleet is not strong enough to attack their main bases. We would be destroyed before we could do significant damage." "I am not suggesting we attack their bases," David replied calmly. "I am suggesting we attack their supply convoys, communication relays, and fuel depots. Small targets that require small forces to destroy, but whose loss will cripple their entire operation." Admiral Stone leaned forward with interest. "Hit-and-run tactics. Strike fast and disappear before they can respond." "Exactly," David said. "But not random strikes. Coordinated attacks designed to create maximum disruption with minimum risk to our forces." He moved to another chart showing shipping routes and communication networks. "The Krek's fleet depends on regular supply runs from their industrial worlds. Cut off those supplies and their advance stops within 2 weeks." "This is not how wars are fought," General Marcus objected. "We are warriors, not pirates and saboteurs. There is no honor in skulking in the shadows and attacking defenseless supply ships." David turned to face the general with an expression that was polite but somehow dangerous. "General, how much honor was there in the massacre at Alpha Colony? How much glory did your warriors find when 20,000 civilians were burned alive by Krek's weapons?" The room fell silent. General Marcus's face reddened, but he had no answer. "The enemy has shown you what kind of war they intend to fight," David continued. "They target civilians, destroy hospitals and schools, and use terror as a weapon. You can choose to fight with honor and watch your people die, or you can choose to fight to win." Queen Lyra spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "What exactly are you proposing?" David returned to the star map and began pointing out specific locations. "Phase 1. We divide our remaining fleet into small strike groups of 2 or 3 ships each. These groups will attack supply convoys along these routes, destroying cargo and escaping before Krek's reinforcements can arrive." "Our ships are not designed for that kind of combat," Admiral Stone said. "They are built for formation fighting, not independent operations." "Then we modify them," David said. "Strip out unnecessary equipment to increase speed and maneuverability. Add long-range sensors and stealth systems. Turn them into hunters instead of fighters." He moved to another section of the map. "Phase 2. While the strike groups are disrupting their supplies, we use special forces teams to attack communication relays and sensor stations. Blind their command structure so they cannot coordinate responses to our attacks." "We do not have special forces," General Marcus said. "You have them now," David replied. "I will train volunteer teams in infiltration and sabotage techniques. Small groups that can reach targets the fleet cannot." "And Phase 3, Lyra asked. David smiled for the first time since the meeting began, but it was not his usual gentle expression. This smile was cold and calculating. "Phase 3 is when their supplies run low and their communications are disrupted and their commanders start making desperate decisions. That is when we hit their main fleet with everything we have left." The implementation of David's plan met with resistance at every level. Veltari military tradition emphasized honorable combat between equals, not the asymmetric warfare that David proposed. Many officers resigned rather than participate in what they saw as cowardly tactics. "Let them go," David told Lyra when she expressed concern about the resignations. We need people who care more about winning than about appearances. The volunteers who remained underwent intensive training in new combat techniques. David worked 18-hour days, teaching strike group commanders how to plan hit-and-run attacks and training special forces teams in sabotage and infiltration. Think like a predator, not like a soldier, he told a group of pilots learning attack patterns. You are not there to fight fair, you are there to kill your target and escape alive. Honor will not bring back dead crew members. The first strikes began 2 weeks later. Small Veltari ships appeared without warning near Krek's supply convoys, destroyed their targets with concentrated firepower, and vanished into hyperspace before enemy escorts could react. The attacks were precisely timed and devastatingly effective. Convoy 77 Alpha destroyed, reported Captain Hayes, commander of Strike Group 3. Cargo included fuel cells and ammunition for the main fleet. No casualties on our side. Similar reports came in from across the combat zone. Supply ships carrying food, medical supplies, and replacement parts were systematically hunted down and destroyed. The Krek's advance, which had seemed unstoppable just weeks before, began to slow as their forward units ran short of essential supplies. At the same time, Special Forces teams struck at communication facilities and sensor arrays throughout Krek's controlled space. David had trained them well in the techniques of sabotage and infiltration that the Terran Defense Corps had perfected during their own campaigns. Target designation Bravo 4 is offline, reported Lieutenant Cole after a successful raid on a communication relay. The enemy will be operating blind in this sector for at least 72 hours. The Krek's response was predictable and exactly what David had hoped for. Frustrated by their inability to catch the elusive Veltari raiders, they began splitting their main fleet into smaller groups to protect their supply lines. This played directly into David's strategy of forcing them to spread their forces thin. They are making the classic mistake, David told Lyra during one of their daily strategy meetings. When an opponent uses unconventional tactics, the natural response is to try to match them. But that means abandoning the advantages that made you strong in the first place. The war that had seemed hopeless just a month before was turning in their favor. Krek's forces found themselves fighting an enemy they could not catch, protecting supply lines they could not adequately defend, and struggling to coordinate attacks when their communications were constantly being disrupted. Our intelligence reports indicate growing dissension among Krek's field commanders, General Marcus reported during a War Council meeting. The general had initially opposed David's tactics but had become one of their strongest supporters as the results became clear. Some of their commanders are requesting permission to withdraw to more defensible positions, Admiral Stone added. Their losses in supply ships and support facilities are becoming unsustainable. David studied the latest tactical reports with satisfaction. The Krek's war machine, which had seemed so formidable when attacking helpless colonies, was proving vulnerable when faced with an opponent who refused to fight by their rules. The end came faster than anyone expected. After 6 weeks of relentless harassment by Veltari strike groups and special forces, the Krek's war machine finally collapsed under the weight of its own logistics problems. Their main fleet, running critically low on fuel and ammunition, attempted one final desperate assault on the Veltari homeworld. David had been waiting for exactly this moment. They will throw everything they have at us now, he told the assembled fleet commanders as they prepared for what would likely be the final battle of the war. They are hungry, tired, and far from home. We are fighting for our families and our world. The outcome should be obvious. The battle was brutal but brief. The Krek's fleet, weakened by weeks of supply shortages and communication failures, could not match the coordinated defense that David had orchestrated. Veltari ships that had learned to fight like wolves in a pack tore apart the larger but less maneuverable Krek's formations. Enemy flagship is requesting terms of surrender, Admiral Stone reported from the bridge of his command ship, his voice filled with disbelief. Patch me through to their commander, David said quietly. The holographic image of a scarred Krek's general appeared on the communication screen, his red scales dulled with exhaustion and defeat. I am Commander Rask of the 3rd Krek's battle fleet, the alien said. I request immediate cessation of hostilities and negotiation of surrender terms. This is David Clark, military advisor to Queen Lyra of the Veltari Empire, David replied. Your surrender is accepted. You will withdraw all Krek's forces from Veltari space immediately and provide full reparations for the civilian casualties you have caused. Agreed, Commander Rask said without hesitation. We have no wish to continue this unusual form of warfare. After the communication ended, Admiral Stone turned to David with curiosity. He seemed almost relieved to surrender. I expected more resistance from a Krex commander. They are used to fighting enemies who meet them head-on, David explained. When conventional tactics fail, they have no backup plan. We showed them a type of warfare they had never encountered before, and they had no idea how to counter it. The formal peace treaty was signed 3 days later in the throne room of the royal palace. Commander Rask and his senior officers stood stiffly as Queen Lyra read the terms that would end the Krex invasion and establish new boundaries between their empires. Throughout the ceremony, David remained in the background, wearing his simple gardener's clothes and tending to the decorative plants that lined the Great Hall. To the Krex delegation, he appeared to be just another palace servant, invisible and unimportant. The human tactics were effective, Commander Rask said privately to Queen Lyra after the formal proceedings concluded. We have never encountered such methods before. Your military advisors are clearly skilled in unconventional warfare. Lyra glanced toward David, who was carefully adjusting the position of a flowering vine near one of the windows. Yes, she said. They are very skilled indeed. The Krex delegation never learned that their defeat had been orchestrated by a human gardener who preferred tending plants to commanding fleets. As far as they knew, the brilliant tactical mind behind the Veltari victory was one of the Queen's unnamed military advisors. In the days that followed the treaty signing, the palace filled with celebration and congratulation. Noble families who had fled during the crisis returned to lavish praise on Queen Lyra's brilliant leadership. Military officers who had once dismissed David's unconventional tactics now spoke of him as a strategic genius. David avoided most of the celebrations, returning instead to his beloved gardens where he could work with his hands in the soil and forget about casualty reports and tactical assessments. Lyra found him there one evening, kneeling beside a flower bed and carefully planting new seedlings. "The war is over," she said, settling down beside him in the dirt despite her royal robes. "Yes," David said, not looking up from his work. "And tomorrow the gardens will still need tending. Do you regret what we did?" David was quiet for a long time, his hands moving gently among the small plants. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret every life that was lost on both sides. But I do not regret saving your people." Lyra watched her husband work, noting the careful way he handled each delicate seedling. "The court wants to give you a medal and a military rank. They think you should be recognized for your contribution to our victory." "No," David said firmly. "I told you the conditions when I agreed to help. No rank, no recognition, no official position. I am the palace gardener, and that is all I want to be. But surely you deserve some acknowledgement for what you accomplished." David looked at her with his calm brown eyes, and she saw that the terrible coldness that had appeared during the war was gone. He was once again the gentle man who had courted her with gifts of seeds and stories about